Spirit of Thersites here. On my history channel, I have frequently observed that the United States is in the midst of a legitimacy crisis. Many observers have lamented this state of affairs, bemoaning the gullibility of people who have fallen prey to conspiracy theories or question the outcome of elections. This legitimacy crisis is partly rooted in the vague impression that things have gone awry, and this impression can and has been stoked by misinformation. However, an uncomfortable truth that few public thinkers are willing to confront is that people have lost faith in the American government because it does not represent the interest of the people and does not do much else besides funnel money to corporations. In this series, I will examine and tier rank all national officials from all 50 states, according to how well they advance the general welfare of their state and the nation as a whole. No legitimacy crisis operates without personnel who sully the whole operation. So, we will go state by state and look at every governor, lieutenant governor, or closest equivalent, U.S. Senator, and member of the House of Representatives. Many people report hating Congress but liking their congressperson. Here we will test the rationality of such a position and almost certainly slaughter a sacred cow or two. Before delving into the dishonor roll of each state, I will consider the broader socio-political conditions in the state in question, knowing how people make their living, the partisan breakdown, and which companies and billionaires run a state can tell you a great deal about why certain politicians behave the way that they do. Make no mistake about it, however, understanding why a politician is terrible does not excuse them being terrible. I have never been one for curbing grades or suffering corruption. My own views are unapologetically leftist and centered around class concerns. If you find yourself bristling at one of my comments or ratings, please know that I take the same amount of responsibility for my words as American politicians do for their actions. None. Now, let's talk about the state of Wyoming. Part of the reason that I chose Wyoming is because I recently visited the state when I took a trip with my girlfriend out to Yellowstone a couple weeks back. And partly it is because Yellowstone has only a few nationally relevant political figures, so I figured it was a good pilot state to start with. Wyoming is the least populous state at 577,735 people as of 2018. Along with Vermont, South Dakota, North Dakota, Delaware, Alaska, and Montana, Wyoming is one of 7 states which has only one representative due to having a low population. So there's only one House member for the entirety of the state. Therefore, actually, the House member sort of represents more people than the senator, a state of affairs which is unusual. Of course, the senators are responsible for representing every citizen in the state as well, but because you get 2 of them, I think some people are okay with the idea that one of their senators maybe isn't their cup of tea. There are 2 major cities in Wyoming. Well, major in the context of Wyoming, of course. You have Casper at 58,000 or so souls, and the most important resident of Casper is one King Cobra JFS, a YouTube legend, and probably the greatest person to ever emerge from the state of Wyoming. The capital and largest city of Wyoming is Cheyenne, slightly larger at 64,000 people, and with a metro area of about 100,000. I'm not sure if that extends all the way to Laramie or not. I would assume the answer is no. As you see here on the upper part of the map, this would be the northwest of the state. Much of the state of Wyoming is consumed by Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks. There also are national forests, so much of Wyoming is being preserved. It is not only lowly populated, but also holds a great deal of natural wonder. In fact, it's possible that Wyoming is the most beautiful of all the states, physically speaking, or if not, then at least it is certainly in the running. Yellowstone, as you all know, has a lot of unusual geology and is a national treasure, no doubt about it. The official name of Wyoming, in terms of its nickname, is the Equality State. And despite its current Republican leanings, the state actually has a progressive past, believe it or not. It was the first state to allow women to vote, first as a territory in 1869, and later in the state constitution of 1889, women were given the right to vote. The first woman governor, actually, was Democrat Nellie Taylor Ross, elected in 1925 to succeed her husband and finish out his term. Democrats surprisingly remained competitive in Wyoming up until about the late 70s. Right now, Wyoming is probably the most Republican state in the entire country by percentage, but Democrats were pretty competitive on every level up until about 1980, give or take. Since then, it has been very red, and the last time a Democratic candidate took the state was 1964. There are 23 counties in the state of Wyoming, and only one of them is blue, while one of them is purple. The other 21 counties are deep red. 70% of registered voters in the state are Republicans, and just 16.5% are Democrats. But despite that, Democrats have actually held their own in gubernatorial races. At least they did up until 2011. Actually, between 1975 and 2011, there were only 8 years of Republican governors. Which, if you think about the demographics of the state, politically speaking, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but Wyoming does what it does the way that it wants to. It's got some libertarian leanings, in case you didn't know. The state has a legislature of 60 members and a Senate of 30, and of course both of these chambers are very solidly Republican. The state also is the home of many political radicals on the right. After Obama was reelected in 2012, there were 9,000 people who signed petitions for Wyoming to secede from the Union. Of course, Wyoming literally could not survive without federal support. Just like many low-population states in the West, Wyoming depends very heavily upon federal money in order to survive. And many residents of Wyoming are people who work for some of these national parks. There aren't a lot of concentrated places of employment. In fact, when I looked it up, one of the places that came up was a university bookstore. So Wyoming tends to have some fairly dispersed places of employment compared to most other states I'm familiar with. 41% of all state spending comes from the federal government. And 5% of the state's residents are federal employees. The two biggest places of employment, actually now that I look at my notes, are two big hospitals. After that, it's tourism, and then there's a big Walmart supercenter probably in the Cheyenne area. The biggest industries overall are coal mining and also gas extraction. The state is a place where there are a lot of interests who want to frack the state, but of course they bump heads with the federal authorities because, as you can see from the map, there is a lot of the state being protected as a national treasure and wildlife preserve. So that is one of the fundamental conflicts in the state between, I guess you could say, the state officials who want to drill baby drill, to quote Sarah Palin, and federal authorities who want to preserve the state that they largely fund. Also, just to give you a bit of an update, Wyoming weathered the pandemic worse than most other states in the country. Per 1,000 people, it had probably the third worst rate of infection, behind only North and South Dakota to its east. There was also a lot of unemployment there, and a lot of jobs were lost. Coal mining has been declining here the way that it did decades ago in Appalachia, so a lot of former miners are now really feeling the pain there. But while a lot of companies are moving out and taking their jobs with them, there are a number of billionaires who are moving to Wyoming to buy up land and try to live sort of a Western cosplay existence. So Wyoming is an odd place, and as I said, a lot of people out there do have sort of a libertarian mentality that is really at odds with how they actually live their life and make their living, and how the roads that they travel down are funded. So It's a bizarre place and a fascinating one, as you would imagine, given that the state produced someone like King Cobra JFS, a national treasure himself on par with Yellowstone. But enough preliminary remarks. Let's get into the main event and tier rank the 5 individuals who represent the state to the nation. Wyoming actually does not have a lieutenant governor, so the second highest official in the state is the Secretary of State, and in this case it is Edward Buchanan. We also will look at Governor Mark Gordon, Senator John Barrasso, Senator Cynthia Lumens, and Representative Liz Cheney. Before we get into this, I was really hoping that I'd find something interesting or unique about any of the people we're talking about, but I didn't. You might think that given how much of politics in Wyoming would be determined in the Republican primary, that there would be a little bit of hidden diversity of thought. Because I have been to places before where it might be all red or all blue, but in the primary, you still see some pretty meaningful differences between candidates. Here, not so much, and also they're not very Wyoming flavored either. A lot of the people we'll look at are basically just carbon copies of exactly the kind of national Republicans that we think of in our imaginations. So if you had to draw up a picture of a generic Republican, at least 4 out of the 5 people we'll talk about fit the bill with 100% accuracy of a generic right-wing Republican on a national level. So, let us get started with Secretary of State Edward Buchanan. You'll be shocked to learn he is a Republican. He is 53 years old, making him the youngest of this group by 1 year. Formerly, he was the Wyoming Speaker of the House, and as apparently is fairly common in Wyoming politics, he was not born in Wyoming, he was actually born in Florida. He was an Air Force vet, and that's as much information as we need for his background. I looked up a lot of his stances on politics, but first what I'll do with all these guys is I want to look up where they get their money. Because he's running for an office that's not super controversial, and because Wyoming, of course, has such a low population, and bison tend not to make very many political contributions, the total amount of money he needed to raise for a Secretary of State race was only $28,000. A lot of that he funded himself, but otherwise he mostly got the rest from realtors and Republican county groups. A lot of the county parties in Wyoming donated $1,000, and one of the organizations was specifically a women's organization for the Republicans. So he's not quite as bought and sold as most other politicians, simply because he doesn't have to be to get where he is. But if you look at his stances, he is very willing to do the bidding of corporate America, and I have no doubt that one day he will seek the governorship or one of the other spots, one of the Senate spots or the House seat. He actually is openly in favor of money in politics. When asked on a questionnaire about whether PACs should be able to spend whatever they want, he said yes. He's open to corporations being able to spend what they want. He didn't quite say that because no one is quite that stupid, but he didn't respond. I have to think that if you were opposed to that, you would say it because it's an incredibly popular stance to have, given that almost no one is in favor of corporations buying politicians. So he's clearly in favor of it, and if you look at him being in favor of PACs and party spending on an unlimited basis, it would kind of only follow that he would feel the same about corporations. He wants to eliminate private exit polls run by the media. As Secretary of State, of course, he's responsible for Wyoming's election laws. And you might think that given that the state is so red and so white, that a lot of the pressures that Republicans face elsewhere to engage in voter suppression would not apply. But I guess because all these people are Fox News creatures, they feel like they have to get in on the action and just do the things other Republicans do to fit in, be one of the cool kids. Buchanan is anti-gay. In many ways, I think he's just sort of the generic Republican number 8. He looks a little like John Delaney And just as John Delaney is a generic corporate Democrat, so too is Edward Buchanan a generic Republican. He's the John Delaney of Republicans. He was very evasive on issues of education, something that he can actually affect. His only stance was he skipped all of the answers when it came to giving stances on education and simply said that they've been spending more in the last 2 years and I need to hold the line on spending. So I find that answer to be evasive. I have noticed too that in general he tries to be cagey and he will only answer when his answer is either in line with what Republicans absolutely require out of their people, whether we're talking about Republican leadership or Republican voters. But when he holds a stance which is unpopular, he will simply pretend he doesn't have a stance. He is also not interested in doing anything more to protect Wyoming's environment or cleaning up contamination. He is basically there to allow for more drilling if possible, despite the fact he actually didn't get anything from those companies to hold that position. As Chomsky said in Manufacturing Consent, the easiest way to get dummies there to do your bidding is to find people who actually believe the shit. Paraphrasing him, of course. Those were not Chomsky's exact words. He also, just like many Republicans, is against medical malpractice suits. So if your doctor butchers your surgery in Wyoming and you go into debt to afford it, well, guess what? I guess you're fucked. The Secretary of State is not on your side. And in general, his stance is that Wyoming should hold the line on spending, even though most of their spending, again, comes from the federal government, so it's not exactly their money to begin with. It's taken from other states and redistributed. So that's all there is to say about Edward Buchanan. Nothing surprising here, but he acts against the interest of his own people. The state of Wyoming has an unemployment crisis. Inequality is spreading as people are losing jobs while billionaires are moving in and becoming feudal landlords. Edward Buchanan has absolutely no interest in helping anyone other than his future donors who will help him get into the House or the Senate or the governor's mansion. Edward Buchanan is an F. His continued participation in politics makes America and his home state of Wyoming worse places to be. Next up is the governor of Wyoming, Republican Mark Gordon. Unlike his Secretary of State, Mark Gordon does receive a lot of money from donors. And we'll see there's actually a little bit of a variety among the Wyoming politicians in terms of where they get their money. Mark Gordon gets his money from Big Ag. So the companies that are more prominent in some of the neighboring states have invested in Mark Gordon. Of course, Wyoming's a little bit more known for ranching than farming, but there's still Big Ag at play, and they definitely like Governor Gordon. He also contributed a lot of his own money. He is a rich kid who grew up on a ranch and inherited a bunch of money, apparently. He went out of state to go to college. He actually went to college in Vermont, graduated with a history degree, and then came home with his wife. His wife tragically passed early, found a second wife, and now they're just rich people living in Wyoming being corporate shills. So, the American dream. He also gets a lot of money from energy companies, and he actually got $5,000 from Charter, you know, the communications company that charges you way too much for internet and tries to bundle it with a home phone you don't need and cable, something that no one needs. He is basically exactly the kind of Republican who is there with a veto pen in order to sign laws that help corporations and veto laws which do not. If a bill protects business from suffering from COVID, Mark Gordon signed off on it and pushed it. If the bill is designed to protect people from rapacious companies, Mark Gordon vetoed it or tried to shoot it down by some other means. He also is in favor of voter ID, which again, given that Wyoming in many places is so small that everybody literally knows everybody, seems a little silly. But whatever. Again, he has to be one of the cool kids and crack down on supposed voter fraud in a state with I believe they only have 230,000 registered voters out of their total population. And of those, I think, well, actually, no, I think it's like 200 and something thousand registered Republicans, 90,000 registered Democrats. So what I'm trying to say is that in other parts of the country, Republicans are pretending that Democrats are winning by illegal means, whereas in Wyoming, even if Democrats cheated like hell, they still couldn't win. So, whatever. He also made a ruling, or not a ruling, but he helped sign a bill that says that public utilities are exempted from liabilities if damages are caused by an act of God. So in other words, if something happened in Wyoming, like what happened in Texas, where the power went out because of negligence on the part of the utility companies and people died, well, tough shit. Act of God. Who could have predicted that it gets cold in one of the coldest states in the country? Or floods. According to insurance companies, floods are acts of God. And the reason why they're acts of God is not so much because they're unpredictable, as because they do a lot of damage and it costs a lot to repair. Mark Gordon is 64 years old. And as I mentioned, he is a native son of Wyoming. And I believe actually he's only there's only one other native Wyomingite on this list. Anything else here of interest? Oh, actually his political career started off a little rough. In 2008, he sought to win the primary for the House seat in Wyoming, but he actually lost to Cynthia Lumens. As I said earlier, all of the political competition in the state is between Republicans in primary races. General races at this point are a waste of time for everyone involved. And I imagine, too, to a certain extent, that might lead a lot of people to register as Republican who aren't really all that Republicans. There's probably at least 10,000 or so people there who aren't really Republicans, but they're registered that way, so that way they can actually participate in the elections that matter. Would just be my guess. My grandpa lived in a hard red county, and he was a Democrat, and that's how he was registered in order to participate in primaries. Okay, let's see. Anything else of interest here? Oh, so Mark Gordon famously allowed people to figure out COVID restrictions for themselves. He didn't want to impose anything, and he called for people to take personal responsibility. This is why COVID has really racked the state so hard. And he did chastise people who didn't take precautions or thought that it was fake and continued to congregate. He called such people knuckleheads, but really did very, very little to correct their behavior. He did impose some restrictions on public gatherings, but only starting in November of 2020. So many months into the pandemic, he finally took some action, and he only started requiring masks in December, and this was specifically after he and his wife contracted COVID. So then he put in a mask mandate, and it only lasted until March. So, total botch job, and also the suffering of all the citizens of Wyoming economically has occurred at his hands as well. It's worth mentioning that despite how fucking cold it is and how obviously people want to get out of cold states as they get older and retire somewhere warmer, Wyoming's population is actually a little older than the national average, and there are more people there who are health compromised, but there are fewer facilities available, and a lot of people cannot afford health insurance. This all falls on the governor. He is an F. Just like with the Secretary of State, the more involvement that Mark Gordon has in politics, the more suffering there will be. He is exactly the kind of person who fuels the legitimacy crisis by refusing to respond to the needs of actual people and by deep-throating corporations. And now on to the people that Wyoming elected to represent them before the rest of us. These are the people who go to D.C. and help craft laws that affect everyone. Up first is Senator John Barrasso, the senior senator from the state. I would like to first point out that 2 out of the 4 committees that he's on are the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, where he's the ranking member, and he's also on the Environment and Public Works Committee. His top 2 donors by field, or by industry, are oil and gas, and then second, securities and investments. In securities and investments, people in that field tend to oppose public works, whereas obviously the oil and gas lobby tends to not be too big on preservation, and they also tend to be big on developing things like natural gas, oil, and coal at any price, environmentally speaking. So it's almost as if he's paid to hold the positions that he holds. Weird. Barrasso is yet another boomer. He's 68 years old, and he was born in the state of Pennsylvania. He, I believe, after... is this him? Or, yeah, okay, so... Barrasso was born in Pennsylvania. He went to med school at Yale, became an orthopedic doctor, and then moved to Casper to open up his own practice. So he was kind of living that Western dream I talked about earlier. Obviously, he's a man with money. Usually you don't get into Yale unless you're born as an alumnus. At least half or so of the people who go there are legacies. So, Barrasso finally got involved in politics starting in 1996, and his start was really centered in the culture wars of the late 90s. He was a hardcore anti-abortion and pro-gun guy. So really showing off that Yale education by getting to the really meaty technocratic issues that, really affect people's lives and really undergird the entire state. Just like many Republicans, but shamefully given how well educated the man is, he denies that man plays a role in climate change. He also told quite a whopper about the Green New Deal. He said that the Green New Deal would ban livestock and that it would be impossible to get a cheeseburger. This, of course, was to stoke fears in the hearts of ranchers and get them to send him their hard-earned money while he sells them out to corporate interest in D.C. Also, John Barrasso, after January 6, defended Donald Trump and went on TV to do so, which is actually the first time I'd ever heard of him. John Barrasso not only undermines the interest of his own constituents, but he undermines the interest of the nation as a whole by fighting against climate change and in favor of energy policies which are regressive and doomed to failure. Barrasso also supported an attempt to overthrow an election result by means of a riot. He is an F. I think it stands to reason that if you promote a lie and then defend an act of violence against the government based on that lie, that you are helping to make a legitimacy crisis that much worse. Next up is the junior senator from Wyoming, Cynthia Lumens. Yet another boomer. She is 66 years old. She beat now Governor Gordon back in 2008 during the House primary, and as I mentioned, when you win a primary as a Republican in Wyoming, that is much more meaningful than winning the general election, which is a given. Sometimes she played a conservationist. She was actually a member of a caucus that talked about conservation, but she is no kind of conservationist in reality. In fact, she backed a couple of bills in the House which would have made it to where state environmental laws can override federal, and where the state governments can approve of fracking and override federal authority. I'm not sure how that would work constitutionally. I imagine such a bill would easily get overturned in court, so I'm not sure why she was wasting her time on that, and it's especially odd given that she is a lawyer. So I really don't know what the hell that was all about, or why she bothered pretending to be an environmentalist when she wants the state to override federal protections and destroy nature. In 2014, after being pretty comfortable as a House member, she faced a strong primary challenge over the government shutdown. As I mentioned, Wyoming has quite a few people who work for the federal government, so the shutdown would have really fucked over a lot of people there, not to mention disrupting local economies and the tourism industry, which is pretty big. So her primary challenger came relatively close to ousting her at that time, and after her narrow victory in 2014, she only served one more term before retiring from the House in 2016. In 2020, one of the senators retired, and she decided to throw her hat in the ring for the other Senate seat. She won the primary and then advanced into the Senate in 2020, taking office in 2021, of course. As soon as she had taken her office, she joined Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley in an attempt to overturn the election result. Of course, she too backs Trump's big lie. So, I think we already kind of know what rating she'll get. Just a couple more notes about her. She has 2 Bachelor of Science degrees that she earned 2 years apart. One is in animal science and another one is in biology. And then she went to law school, as I mentioned. So I don't know what field of law she was in, but apparently it was not constitutional. Because as we mentioned, you cannot have state law override federal. That is against every legal principle in America. When we look at who gives her money, she does get money from oil and gas and from law firms, but those are less important. Her main source of income is from groups that are affiliated with the Republican Party or with conservative organizations. So she gets money from more traditional political PACs, and I guess people figured that she was a reliable conservative, so they wanted to send her back to D.C., you know, to make sure that, I guess, she beat whatever Democrat would come along and get 16% of the vote. Can't be too careful in Wyoming. Anyway, I think it's safe to say that just like everyone else we've discussed here, Cynthia Lumens does everything in her power to delegitimize the American way of life. She makes life worse for her constituents. She makes the national discourse worse. And she does everything in her power to make people poorer and sicker. She is an F. Last, and actually not least, shockingly enough, Representative Liz Cheney, the sole House member from the state of Wyoming, and the daughter of former Vice President and Sith Lord Dick Cheney. Her 2 biggest donors are securities and investment, real estate, oil and gas. So actually those are the big 3 for her. And among oil and gas, we should always remember that in Wyoming that means mining as well. Of course, despite the fact that she's mostly a creature of Wall Street, if you look at her donations, she is far and away best known as a pro-torture war hawk carrying on the legacy of her father. She, despite being sort of an icon of the old Bush Republicans, the openly pro-corporate, pro-war Republican Party, which tried not to get too deep into cultural issues. I mean, they play to them, but they don't go balls deep in them. Despite being the poster child of that movement, she was one of the most reliable votes Trump had in the House. People forget that now because of some recent events, but Liz Cheney voted with Trump more than many Republicans did. The only things where they differed are that Liz Cheney is, as a neoconservative, 100% behind free trade under any circumstance, whereas, of course, Trump advocated for some limited protectionism. Another difference is that while Trump is not nearly so peaceful as some of his supporters like to pretend, he did prove to be a little less hawkish than contemporary presidents, but Liz Cheney, of course, being the avatar of neoconservatism, wanted him to rattle the saber just a little harder. But aside from that, they got along pretty damn well, and I'm sure Trump was willing to overlook the fact that he was Dick's daughter, or she was Dick's daughter, even though he might not have actually known that because he's Donald Trump and he tends to miss a lot of things. But then, Liz Cheney, who was one of the darlings of the whole party, and rising through the ranks as a 54-year-old member with presidential ambitions, did something that she thought was bold, but that her party hates her for. She opposed the big lie. After January 6th, when she and her colleagues were almost stormed by a mob of raving lunatics looking for lizard pedophiles, Liz Cheney said that Trump had lied about the election and that he had really fomented violence. Or fomented, excuse me, not fomented. Whatever. You know what I meant. Anyhow, Some of them have actually called her a traitor to her party. The Wyoming Republican Party has actually asked Liz Cheney to resign over that. So just pointing out that Trump lied about something that he obviously lied about, and expressing an opinion, doing what she thought was her duty as a member of the House of Representatives, expressing her views, in the eyes of the Republican Party of Wyoming, this is unforgivable, and she should be removed from office at once. The Wyoming Republican Party is profoundly fucked. Some of the Trumpites also hate her because she defended Anthony Fauci once or twice. I don't know what will happen to her. She got removed from leadership in favor of Elise Stefanik, who actually only voted with Trump about 65% of the time, so she's considerably more moderate than Liz Cheney, who voted with Trump 90-something% of the time. But Stefanik is willing to kiss Trump's ass, which is apparently now the organizing principle of the party. Liz Cheney still has presidential aspirations, and she assumes the fever will break when it comes to Trump's stranglehold over the party. She wants to take the party back to the glory days of George W. Bush. Newsflash, there was still a legitimacy crisis under Bush. Bush was not much better than Trump, if he was at all. Bush provoked other fears, and some of the same fears, just to a lesser extent. And in fact, if we look at how they got along for almost the entirety of Trump's term, and how they had very few interests or clashes, we can see that for all of the rhetorical differences about how far the Republican Party has fallen, it has not really fundamentally changed in 20 years. It just has a worse tan now. So, despite the fact that Liz Cheney made one move, which was somewhat brave-ish in the context of such a shitty political system and such a moment of partisan madness, she's still an F. She's pro-torture. She's pro-war. She wants to change nothing that would actually help anyone. She's not in favor of relieving the poverty or unemployment of the people of Wyoming. She's not in favor of making it easier to vote. She's not in favor of protecting the environment. She's not in favor of making sure that corporate power doesn't completely control American life at every level. So she's not a fucking hero. She was right about one thing that was extremely obvious. Big whoop. So yeah, well done, Wyoming. As I said, the greatest Wyomingite is, without a doubt, King Cobra JFS. That's all I have for you. I will come back. Next time, we'll be looking at the state of Kentucky. After that, I'm not sure what we'll look at next, but I might bring in someone to help me with this going forward, at least on a part-time basis, you know, see how that works out. But as things stand, these are the men and women who represent the state of Wyoming to the rest of the country, and I think it's safe to say they do a really fucking terrible job of representing their state. Wyoming would be better off electing moose, elk, bear, and bison to represent them. I mean, they would do a much better job. Anyhow, that's all I have for you. I'm Spirit of Thersites, and I will see you around.